Hello and welcome to Hexed Encountered. My name is Joe. This is the Hexed Encountered review of the second printing of the game Atlantic Chase. This is designed by Jerry White and published by GMT Games. The game debuted in 2021 and quickly sold out, which is, a sure sign of a good game. So it took just under 2 years or so for a P500 reprint to actually hit the mark and have the game produced and delivered to customers. And that period is really something of a blink of an eye in P500 terms because, some of those can last a lot longer and can be pretty frustrating for those of us who are waiting for that magic number to arrive and for the game to get through the production process, the printing process, the shipping process, etc., etc. So I did back this second printing as a P5 on P500, and I was really thrilled to actually finally get the game in my hands. And so now that I've played it, I am ready to provide a review. And if you're one of those too long didn't read / too long didn't watch types, the bottom line for me is that this is a fantastic game. First, a little background. Atlantic Chase is an operational level game of, you guessed it, the Battle of the Atlantic, during the Second World War. It pits the British Royal Navy against Germany's Kriegsmarine. The focus is on the surface forces. So while British subs, German U-boats, and the air assets of both sides do play a role in the game, that role is decidedly a supporting role and not a starring role. So the map is a large hex-based map covering the North Atlantic from the coast of North America, basically the northern part of North America, New York and north, essentially, including Canada. So it stretches from that coast all the way to basically the western end of the Baltic at the port of Kiel in Germany. And north-south, it runs from the Arctic Circle all the way to basically the approaches to the South Atlantic. Just around the, where Africa and South America are, essentially. So that covers a lot of open water. One of the first things that really shows Jerry White's innovative design in this case is that the game's primary counters, which are the ships themselves, capital ships have their own individual counter, while convoys and destroyers, for example, would have, they have multi-ship. Basically, they represented multiple ships on one counter. But anyway, these counters don't live on the map themselves. Okay, you'll never see King George V or the Hood or any of those ships, the Bismarck on the map itself. It will always be on these task force displays, and those are basically 8.5 by 11-inch cards that are broken up into spaces for each for various task forces. Now, the British card has space for 10 different task forces. And each of those will have a color, and then a band on all the pieces. Essentially, there'll be a band displayed there, from no bands up to 2, in some cases 3, 4 bands, depending on what it is. That will let you kind of designate which task force that is. So the German task force display only has space for 5 task forces, which kind of is, a direct result of the difference in the sizes between the two navies, right? Both sides' displays also include reinforcement boxes. So there will be ships that will appear, at various points. Oftentimes, they will be optional whether or not you want to bring them into play. But you do have reinforcement boxes that typically will be located in one of the ports for the game. So the Germans have a variety of ports, which Kiel and Wilhelmshaven are the 2 main ones, but those obviously are German ports. Depending on what scenario you're playing, you may have access to Norwegian and or French ports as well. Whereas the British, obviously, they have their ports at home. There are some scenarios where France is still part of the Allies, and obviously Canadian ports are also considered British ports. And then once the Americans are in the war, you also have some United States ports in there as well. Okay, so what's on the map exactly? Well, what plays on the map are these wooden pieces. Some of them are cylinders, and there are also these kind of thin rectangular blocks, and those are used to represent the task forces on the map. The cylinders are called stations, and they represent a ship's known location in space and time. So that is, we both players, know that this task force, which can be comprised of one ship or several, we know that that force is in this hex, this specific place. The rectangular pieces, on the other hand, are called trajectory segments, and this is where Jerry White's innovation really becomes apparent. Trajectories represent, we know that this task force is somewhere along this path, but are uncertain where exactly that is on the path. So it's fog of war, but it's in a new way, based on the concept of using like the string on the map in a war room. So, envision a situation where Churchill is staring at it in his inimitable bulldogish way with his cigar clamped between his teeth, wondering where my convoy is, right? So that string, it not only represents the enemy ships, but it also represents your own, because you don't know where your own ships are. Obviously, this is wartime. The ships are not going to be radioing their positions constantly back to headquarters or whatever, because obviously the enemy can use that to triangulate and break. There was also code breaking, of course, as well. So you want to limit information for your enemy, but in doing that, you also limit that information for yourself. So this is a really clever way to provide the limited information of this, this battle to the player, while still allowing the player to plan and act on the information that they do have. So key to this is the length of the trajectory. So each trajectory can actually be 15 segments long, no longer than that, and they can be as short as one segment. But longer trajectories means you have less of an idea of where the task force actually is, while shorter means your information is better and you kind of narrowed it down to, maybe a handful of hexes as opposed to 15. So this impacts the actions that you can take upon those trajectories, because actions that involve longer trajectories are more apt to be unsuccessful. You might fail. It's harder to succeed when you're dealing with a really long trajectory, because that represents a lot of ocean and you don't know exactly where these ships are. But on the other hand, actions that involve forces with short trajectories, or better yet, stations that have a known location, those are a lot more likely to be successful. So that's the key, is to try and get those trajectories to be short. And then, so what about actions? Okay, there are 9 actions that you can take when you have the initiative, of course. So these run the gamut from utilizing your air and stealth forces like submarines and mines, to doing things like searching for the enemy, attempting to engage the enemy, or in some cases just completing, which is an action, complete a trajectory to get it safely into port. This is, key for things like convoys, right? You get your convoy close enough to Clyde, Liverpool, you can complete and have them, basically dash into port where they're then safe, and you get victory points for that, typically if you're playing as the British. So, setting up and using these actions correctly is absolutely vital to success. Yes, you will need to roll dice, and you will need to get good dice rolls ultimately, because that's, kind of the case in many war games. I won't say most or all or whatever, because that's untrue, but many war games. And your chances are significantly improved when you do things in the right sequence, because you will shorten your trajectories by doing so. So, every action's harder, as I mentioned, when you use it on a long trajectory, and easier on a shorter one, right? So you can shorten trajectories in a variety of ways, most of which also have the somewhat unfortunate side effect from your standpoint of shortening your own trajectories, because that, of course, means the enemy's information is more precise and therefore more advantageous for them. And when initiative switches, they can take advantage of that. So initiative does change in a variety of ways depending on the actions the player currently holding it takes. And this is important because as the inactive player, you're really limited in what you can do. You can do what they call interrupt, assuming that you have some intelligence and an intel marker on your opponent's trajectory or station that they're actually trying to use to do something with. Other than that, there's not a whole lot you can do as the inactive player. So if you don't have initiative and you fail to get initiative, you start getting die roll modifiers every time you fail to gain initiative. But while you're inactive, you have to sit there and watch as your enemy hones in on maybe an all-important task force and, basically wrecks your plans. And so to me, this is really an extremely clever system. So you'll end up with trajectories that cross each other or at least intersect as you attempt to nail down the enemy's location while hopefully not getting yourself in a bind doing so. And for the Germans in particular, this is often a precarious task. The Kriegsmarine has limited resources and needs to be both bold and careful at the same time, and that's a tightrope act of the first magnitude. The Royals, that's not to say the Royal Navy's task is easy, because it's not. They have convoys to protect, and these convoys are pretty vulnerable, and the rules typically will prevent the player from loading up a convoy with, a bunch of big, powerful ships. In most cases, you're going to be limited to having one ship as an escort, and this could possibly range from anything from a destroyer squadron up to a battleship, or maybe even an aircraft carrier, although a carrier and a convoy together by themselves would also be vulnerable, because aircraft carriers, and if they get into a gunfight, probably not great for them. All in all, I'd say the game does an excellent job of portraying the real-life cat-and-mouse nature of the battle for the Atlantic. There are mechanics for intel, as I mentioned, and these will generate intel markers. You can get invasive action markers. You get contact markers. Typically, when you bump up against an enemy in a skirmish or a fight, and it's indecisive, nobody wins, no one gets sunk, whatever. You'll get or even if somebody does get sunk, you'll get a contact marker. And the battle game itself, that is fairly simple and straightforward, but it's mechanically sound and makes sense. And for those who do want some more meat on the bone, there is a set of advanced battle rules that make things more realistic, or more involved at least, and apply some strategic layers beyond the basic strategies that you can apply in the base battle game. So it's kind of a mini game. There are scenarios that are specifically designed to be played out on the battle board, and those work really well when you do use the advanced battle rules. So the folks that will be interested in this game are likely familiar with the real-life history of what happened in the Battle of the Atlantic. The chase and the sinking of German raiders like the Graf Spee, and of course the most famous of all, the search for an ultimate destruction of the Bismarck. And yeah, there are scenarios that feature both the Graf Spee and the Bismarck. The game includes a slew of scenarios covering the course of the war from the early days of even like before the war really began. So August, September 39, when, in the period when the British and the French fought together, all the way through the loss of Norway, the loss of France, and into 1942, when France was occupied and the Soviet Union and US were both part of the Allied forces at that point. So there are counters for both the French and the US, a handful. This is mainly a British show on the Allied side, as you would expect. But convoys to Murmansk to support the Soviet Union are part of the game. And obviously, the United States has some ships for those 1942 scenarios. So there are a bunch of solitaire scenarios. There are a bunch of multiplayer, two-player scenarios. And there's even a campaign game where you kind of build and marshal your forces over time. And it's played in a series of operations, which typically cover a year, but that's not always the case. And, things carry over from operation to operation. Each operation is scored as well. So you could win an operation, or, to use a familiar term, you can win the battle and lose the war ultimately, kind of thing, over time. And for the solo player, I'll just say this game is a real goldmine, okay? Not only is there a booklet full of solitaire scenarios, but each of those solitaire scenarios has an individual AI bot that's been crafted to utilize, tables in different ways with specific rules for each scenario to manage the enemy forces. So each one is basically crafted. There's not like an overall system. Yes, it kind of works the same way in each one, but each table is, it varies to account for the various situations between the two navies, what's going on, what each side is trying to accomplish, et cetera, et cetera. I will say this, the AI handles the British better than it handles the Germans, probably because the British have a superior position. But not only that, okay, not only the solitaire stuff, the two-player stuff is eminently playable solitaire. You just manage both sides to the best of your ability, which is something that a lot of us, if not most of us, have done, many times with various games. That works really well in this game. There is no hidden information. I mean, there is, but it's not like off the board hidden information. You see a trajectory. You don't know where the ships are, but that applies not only to the enemy forces, but your own. So it works. It works. The hidden stuff works well. So to sum it all up, I can't recommend this game highly enough. It does an incredible job of managing that uncertainty, the fog of war of the Battle of the Atlantic, trying to find and kill the enemy, trying to sneak your convoys through the German raiders, etc., trying to break your ships out of the British blockade early in the war, etc., etc. It's all in there. It's all in there, and it's done in a fresh and innovative way that really just works. To me, there's a lot of places this can grow, and on the box it does say Intercept Volume 1. So this would be, I guess, the Intercept series, and I'm looking forward to Volume 2, which, like I said, I've heard is going to be the Pacific, and fingers crossed that is the case, because that would be outstanding as well. We'd obviously have an expanded role for the aircraft carrier in that situation, and I'd love to see Jerry White's take on that, because he has quickly proven with this game and some of his other games that he really is a creative guy who comes up with, innovative ways, whether it's this game or, the Above the Reich, Above the Britain games, his Enemy Coast Sighted game, the Doolittle Raid. All of these are all just really, really well done games, and very solitaire friendly, of course, since most of the games I mentioned are solitaire games. So that is going to do it. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you got some good information from this, and it will help you make a decision on whether you think Atlantic Chase is a game for you. But yeah, that's going to do it. My name is Joe. This has been Hexed Encountered, and until next time, happy gaming.